the frozen heart of a forgotten mountain range lies Silvår, a secluded village trapped in perpetual winter. Its inhabitants hold a dark secret. Every year on the longest night, a mysterious frost spirit awakens, demanding offerings to keep the village safe. When a skeptical outsider stumbles into Silvår, he unknowingly disrupts the ancient pact, unleashing a chain of events that threatens to destroy them all. The snow fell heavy and fast, blanketing the winding mountain road in a sheet of blinding white. Mark cursed under his breath as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the rental car's tires slipping on the icy pavement. The GPS had long since lost its signal, and the printed map on the passenger seat was little help in the storm. He was supposed to be on his way to a ski resort, a last-minute Christmas retreat to escape the mess of his personal life. Instead, he was hopelessly lost, driving deeper into an unfamiliar wilderness. The storm worsened, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The headlights barely illuminated the snow-choked road ahead, and Mark's nerves were fraying fast. Then, through the haze of the storm, he saw it, a faint, golden glow flickering in the distance. A village. Relief washed over him as he steered toward the light, the car's tires crunching through the thick snow. The village was like something out of a storybook. Tiny cottages lined narrow cobblestone streets, their windows glowing warmly against the night. The storm seemed to ease as Mark entered, the wind dying to a faint whisper. He parked the car near what appeared to be a small inn, its sign swaying gently in the breeze. The Frostbound hearth. A group of villagers, bundled in thick wool coats and scarves, watched him from a distance, their faces shadowed by the hoods of their cloaks. Mark stepped out, shivering as the cold bit through his jacket.
"Hey, can someone help me? I got lost in the storm."
The villagers didn't respond. They stood motionless, their eyes fixed on him with expressions he couldn't quite read.
"Great," Mark muttered, grabbing his bag from the car. He approached the inn's door and pushed it open, the warmth inside hitting him like a wave. The inn's common room was small but cozy, with a roaring fireplace and the faint smell of spiced cider. A woman stood behind the counter, her dark hair streaked with silver and tied in a loose braid. She looked up as Mark entered, her expression a mix of surprise and something else. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but wary. "You've come far." Mark dropped his bag on the floor and blew into his hands to warm them. "Yeah, farther than I meant to. I was trying to get to Alpen Ridge, but the storm—"
The woman's face darkened. "The storm rarely lets anyone leave."
Mark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before she could answer, the door opened behind him and a man stepped in. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of harsh winters. His gaze immediately locked onto Mark. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice gruff.
"Relax," Mark said, holding up his hands. "I'm just passing through. Got lost in the storm and saw the lights. I'll be out of here as soon as it clears." The man exchanged a glance with the innkeeper, his jaw tightening. "The storm doesn't clear quickly here," he said.
Mark sighed. "Fine, I'll stay for the night. How much for a room?" The woman hesitated, then motioned toward the stairs. "Room 3, it's yours for the night." Mark thanked her and grabbed his bag, ignoring the way the man's eyes followed him as he climbed the stairs. The room was small but comfortable, with a sturdy bed and a single window overlooking the village square. Mark dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the bed, running a hand through his damp hair. Outside, the storm had picked up again, the wind howling like a living thing. He glanced out the window and froze. The villagers were still there, standing in the square. Their hoods were pulled low, but their faces were turned toward his window, their gazes locked on him. Mark shivered and drew the curtains shut.
He fell asleep to the sound of the wind, but his dreams were restless. He dreamed of the villagers, their faces pale and expressionless. He dreamed of the forest beyond the village, its trees black and twisted. And he dreamed of something else, something vast and cold, watching from the shadows. When he woke, the room was freezing. The fire in the small hearth had gone out, and a thin layer of frost coated the window panes.
Mark sat up, rubbing his arms for warmth. Something about the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. He opened the curtains and peered outside. The villagers were gone. Mark dressed quickly and headed downstairs, determined to find answers. The common room was empty, save for the innkeeper, who was stoking the fire. She looked up as he approached, her expression tense.
Where is everyone?
Mark asked. They're preparing, she said quietly. Preparing for what? The innkeeper hesitated, then motioned for him to sit. You shouldn't have come here, she said. This is a sacred place, bound by ancient rules. Outsiders. They disrupt the balance.
Mark frowned. What balance? What are you talking about? She glanced toward the window, her voice dropping to a whisper. Tonight is the longest night of the year. The frost spirit will awaken. We must honor it, or it will take what it is owed.
Mark stared at her, disbelief written across his face. You can't be serious. She looked at him sharply. Do you think the storm brought you here by accident? You were meant to come. The spirit demands a life, and this year it may choose you. Before Mark could respond, the door slammed open, and the gruff man from the night before entered, his face grim. It's time, he said. The innkeeper nodded and stood, her expression resigned. She turned to Mark. Stay here. Do not leave this room, no matter what you hear. Mark's pulse quickened. What happens if I do? The man's gaze was cold. You won't come back. As the villagers gathered in the square, Mark stood by the window watching them. They carried lanterns and small bundles of what looked like food, placing them at the base of a massive stone obelisk in the center of the square. The obelisk was covered in frost, its surface etched with strange, spiraling symbols. The wind howled, and Mark thought he saw something move at the edge of the forest, something tall and thin, its form shrouded in a swirling mist. A chill ran down his spine. The frost spirit had awakened. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows as if trying to pry them open. Mark stood frozen by the window, staring out at the obelisk in the square. The villagers moved in a solemn procession, their faces obscured by heavy cloaks. They carried offerings to the stone, bundles of food, carved trinkets, even candles flickering weakly in the storm. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. At the forest's edge, he saw it again. The frost spirit. It was taller than any human, its form impossibly thin and hunched. Its body was wrapped in a shifting veil of frost and mist, and its face, if it had one, was obscured by a pale glow. The very sight of it made Mark's stomach twist, his instincts screaming at him to look away. But he couldn't. The villagers knelt as the frost spirit moved closer, its long, clawed fingers trailing the air like a conductor leading a silent orchestra. The obelisk began to glow faintly, the symbols etched into its surface pulsing with icy light. Mark's breath hitched. This wasn't a game, a story, or some bizarre local superstition. The thing outside was real, and it was coming closer. The door to the inn creaked open behind him, and Mark spun around. It was the innkeeper, her face pale and drawn. "You looked," she said, her voice trembling. Mark frowned. "What?" "You were watching the ritual, weren't you?" She stepped closer, her eyes wide with fear. "The spirit knows. It's seen you now."
Mark's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" The innkeeper hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The frost spirit takes what it is owed. An offering must be made to keep it bound to the forest. By watching, you've..." She trailed off, glancing toward the window. "I've what?" Mark snapped, his voice rising.
She flinched, but met his gaze. "You've marked yourself. It might choose you." Mark's stomach churned. He stepped away from the window, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. "What happens if it chooses me?"
The innkeeper didn't answer. "Tell me." She closed her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "You won't leave this place. Not alive."
The air in the room grew colder, and Mark swore he heard faint whispers coming from the forest. The innkeeper crossed herself and muttered a prayer under her breath. "I told you to stay upstairs," she said. "You shouldn't have looked."
Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space. "I didn't know what was happening. You're telling me some thing out there wants to kill me because I looked at it?" "It doesn't want to kill you," she said softly. "It wants to take you. There's a difference."
The words chilled him to his core. He grabbed his coat and threw it over his shoulders. "No, I'm not staying here to wait for some ice monster to drag me away. I'm leaving, now!" The innkeeper blocked his path, her hands gripping his arms tightly. "You can't leave," she said, her voice desperate. "The storm will stop you. The forest won't let you go." Mark shoved past her, his heart pounding. He didn't care how impossible it seemed. He wasn't going to sit around and let some spirit decide his fate. Outside, the storm raged, the snow falling so thick it was hard to see. The villagers were gone, their ritual complete. But the obelisk still glowed faintly, its icy light pulsing in time with the whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. Mark climbed into his car, his hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine sputtered, but didn't start. He cursed and tried again.
The second attempt worked. The car roared to life, and Mark slammed it into gear, the tires spinning before catching traction. He headed back the way he had come, the headlights barely cutting through the swirling snow.
The road seemed endless, the trees pressing closer with every mile. The storm grew worse, the wind howling like a living thing, and Mark began to feel as though he were driving in circles. Panic clawed at his chest. He checked the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't moved. Time itself felt frozen, the world outside trapped in an endless, unrelenting winter. And then he saw it. The frost spirit stood in the middle of the road, its glowing form almost blinding against the dark trees. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding wildly before coming to a stop, just feet from the figure. For a moment, everything was silent. The wind, the storm, the whispers, all of it stopped. Mark stared, his breath fogging the glass as he gripped the steering wheel. The frost spirit tilted its head as though studying him. Then slowly it raised one long clawed finger and pointed back toward the village. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the car didn't move. The tires spun uselessly in the snow, the engine revving like a wounded animal. The frost spirit didn't move. Mark threw the door open and stumbled into the storm, the cold biting into his skin like 1,000 needles. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The spirit's gaze, or what he imagined was its gaze, remained fixed on him. Then it spoke. Its voice was not a voice at all, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very air. Words formed in Mark's mind, not in his ears. Return. Balance must be restored.
Mark staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm not going back there."
The spirit's form seemed to ripple, its frost-laden cloak shifting like waves. The snow around Mark's feet froze solid, locking him in place. "Return!" the voice echoed again, more forceful this time. Mark's vision blurred, his thoughts spinning wildly. The frost spirit raised its hand, and the snowstorm surged around him, swallowing the road, the trees, and everything else. When the world settled, Mark found himself standing back in the village square. The obelisk loomed before him, its glow stronger now, and the villagers were there again, their faces obscured by their hoods. The innkeeper stepped forward, her expression grim. "You can't run," she said. "It won't let you." Mark's knees buckled, and he collapsed into the snow. "What does it want from me?" The gruff man from before stepped into the light, his voice cold. "The frost spirit demands a life. If it doesn't take one, the storm will consume us all."
Mark's head snapped up. "Why me?"
The man's gaze hardened. "You came here? You disrupted the pact. The spirit has chosen you to restore balance." Mark's mind raced. He thought of his life back home, the career he'd ruined, the family he'd drifted away from. He thought of the frost spirit's glowing form, its unrelenting presence. Was there really no way out? The innkeeper knelt beside him, her voice softer now. "Sometimes a sacrifice can break the cycle," she said. "But it's dangerous. If you fail..."
Mark met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "What do I have to do?"
The village square was deathly silent, save for the faint hum emanating from the obelisk. Mark stood in its shadow, his body trembling from a mix of cold and fear. The villagers surrounded him in a loose circle, their faces obscured beneath heavy hoods. The innkeeper remained by his side, her gaze steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "You can't run from this," she said. "The forest has chosen you, but if you're willing, there may be a way to end it."
Mark's fists clenched. "You said something about breaking the cycle. What does that mean?"
She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the obelisk. "The frost spirit demands balance. For centuries we've paid with offerings, food, trinkets, sometimes lives, to keep it bound to the forest. But the cycle is endless. It will never stop unless..."
"Unless what?" Mark pressed.
"Unless someone confronts it directly," she said. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You'd have to face it in its true form, deep in the forest where its power is strongest. If you succeed, the spirit can be bound permanently. The village would be free."
Mark's chest tightened. "And if I fail?" Her gaze hardened. "Then it will take you, and the storm will consume everything."
The gruff man stepped forward, his face visible now in the dim light. Deep scars cut across his weathered features, and his expression was grim. "No one has ever succeeded," he said. "Not in all the years we've tried. The spirit is ancient, older than the village itself. It doesn't bargain. It doesn't show mercy." Mark met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "You're saying it's either me or all of you? Is that it?" The man nodded. That's the price of stepping into this place. You disrupted the balance. Now you have to restore it. Mark glanced at the obelisk, its faint blue glow pulsing like a heartbeat. The whispers of the forest pressed against his mind, growing louder with each passing second. He felt the weight of their stares, the villagers, the innkeeper, even the wolves lurking at the edge of the square. He didn't want to die, but if he didn't act, these people would pay the price. Finally, he exhaled, his breath misting in the icy air.
What do I have to do?
The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The innkeeper stepped forward and handed Mark a small silver dagger. Its blade was etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light.
This will guide you, she said. The spirit's power is tied to its heart. If you can reach it, you must sever the connection, but you'll have to go alone. The forest won't allow anyone else to follow.
Mark swallowed hard, the weight of the dagger heavy in his hand. How will I know where to go? The gruff man gestured toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the square.
The forest will lead you. It always does.
Mark's heart pounded as he turned to face the looming shadows of the forest. The storm swirled violently overhead, the snow falling in thick waves. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The forest swallowed him immediately. The wind died to a low whisper, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. Mark's footsteps crunched softly in the snow, the only sound in the suffocating silence. The dagger in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow casting eerie shadows on the twisted trees around him. He followed the light, his breath fogging the air as he moved deeper into the woods. The path twisted and turned, leading him through narrow gaps between ancient trunks and over frozen streams. The further he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands.
And always, just at the edge of his vision, he saw movement. Shapes flitting through the shadows, too fast and too quiet to be human.
The bells began to ring again, their chime soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. Mark gritted his teeth, the sound growing louder with each step. Finally, the path opened into a wide clearing. At its center stood the frost spirit. It was larger now, its form towering over the trees. Its body was wreathed in swirling frost and shadow, and its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness like twin stars. The obelisk was there too, or something like it. A massive, jagged pillar of ice rose from the ground, its surface covered in pulsing blue symbols. Mark felt the whispers in his mind grow louder, sharper, as though the forest itself were alive and screaming. The frost spirit turned its gaze on him, and the air grew so cold it burned. Mark raised the dagger, his hand trembling. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, though his voice betrayed his fear.
The spirit didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence pressed down on him like a physical weight, forcing him to his knees.
The symbols on the pillar glowed brighter, and Mark felt the ground tremble beneath him. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices urging him to give up, to surrender. But he didn't. With a surge of determination, Mark pushed himself to his feet and charged toward the pillar. The frost spirit moved faster than he thought possible, its clawed hand slashing through the air. Mark dove to the side, the ice where he'd stood shattering into razor-sharp shards. He rolled to his feet and ran again, dodging as the spirit's claws tore through the snow. The dagger pulsed in his hand, guiding him closer to the pillar. The spirit roared, a sound that shook the trees and sent icy wind ripping through the clearing. Mark felt the frost biting into his skin, slowing his movements, but he didn't stop. He reached the pillar and raised the dagger, its light blazing brighter than ever. The frost spirit lunged, its massive form crashing toward him. Mark drove the blade into the pillar with all his strength, the symbols on its surface flaring violently. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the pillar shattered. The explosion of light and sound threw Mark backward, the ground shaking as shards of ice flew through the air. The frost spirit let out an ear-piercing scream, its form dissolving into mist as the forest itself seemed to convulse. Mark hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He lay there, staring up at the swirling storm as the whispers faded into nothing. When he finally sat up, the clearing was empty. The pillar was gone, and the frost spirit had vanished. The forest was quiet again, its oppressive presence lifted. Mark staggered to his feet, the shattered remains of the dagger lying at his feet. He turned and began the long walk back to the village, his body aching, but his heart lighter. When he emerged from the forest, the storm had stopped. The village was bathed in the soft glow of dawn, the air still and peaceful. The villagers were waiting for him in the square, their faces a mix of shock and awe. The innkeeper stepped forward, her expression softening as she saw him. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his legs barely holding him upright. "The spirit is gone, the cycle is broken." The villagers erupted into cheers, their relief palpable. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching him, its silent gaze lingering even as the village celebrated. The dawn broke over Silvår, painting the snow in hues of pale gold and silver. The storm had passed, and for the first time since Mark had arrived, the air felt calm. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces alight with cautious relief. But Mark wasn't celebrating. He stood apart from the crowd, leaning heavily against the remnants of the obelisk. His body ached, his hands trembling from the frostbite that had started to creep in during his confrontation with the spirit. "The frost spirit is gone," he told the innkeeper as she approached. "But I don't think this is over." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You broke the cycle. You freed us." Mark shook his head. "I destroyed the pillar, but that spirit, it didn't die. It retreated. I could feel it pulling back into the forest, like it's waiting for something. I don't think it's bound to the obelisk anymore. I think it's free now." The innkeeper's face paled. She opened her mouth to respond, but a shout from the edge of the square interrupted her. One of the villagers, a young man who had been patrolling the outskirts, came sprinting toward them. "The forest!" he cried, his voice laced with panic. "The trees! They're moving!" The villagers froze, their murmurs growing louder. Mark pushed off the obelisk and followed the young man toward the tree line. The sight made his stomach drop.
The forest was alive.
The trees, ancient and gnarled, were shifting slowly, their massive roots tearing through the frozen ground. The shadows between them deepened, twisting into unnatural shapes. The snow that fell around the village was no longer soft and light. It was dark, like ash, and it hissed when it touched the ground. The frost spirit's presence lingered in the air, heavier than ever. Mark turned to the innkeeper, his jaw tight. "This isn't over. The spirit's power is still tied to this place, and it's stronger now without the obelisk holding it back. We need to stop it, or it'll destroy everything."
"How?" she asked, her voice shaking. "The obelisk was our only connection to the spirit's heart. Without it, there's nothing left to bind or contain it." Mark thought of the dagger, now shattered into fragments back in the forest. He thought of the frost spirit's glowing form, the way it had seemed to ripple with fury as he struck the pillar. "It's not bound anymore," he said slowly. "But that means it's vulnerable. If we can lure it back into the clearing and face it directly, we might be able to destroy it completely."
The gruff man from earlier stepped forward, his expression grim. "You're saying we fight it?" Mark nodded. "It's the only way." The villagers scrambled to prepare. They gathered what weapons they had: axes, knives, even sharpened farming tools. Mark worked with the innkeeper to create makeshift torches, dousing rags in oil and tying them to wooden poles. "The spirit hates fire," he said, handing one of the torches to the gruff man. "It's the only thing I've seen that seems to hurt it."
As the villagers moved toward the edge of the square, Mark turned to Jakob, the young man who had raised the alarm. "Stay behind," Mark said firmly. Jakob bristled. "I can fight."
"This isn't about fighting," Mark said. "It's about surviving. If something happens to us, someone needs to warn the outside world." Jakob hesitated, then nodded reluctantly and stepped back. The group moved into the forest, their torches flickering weakly in the growing darkness. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Mark led the way, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He could feel the spirit watching them, its presence pressing down on his mind like a heavy weight. The bells began to toll again, soft at first, then louder with each step. "We're close," Mark said, his voice tight.
The clearing came into view, its snow-covered expanse eerily still. The shards of the obelisk still littered the ground, glowing faintly in the dim light.
And then the frost spirit appeared. It emerged from the shadows, its massive form wreathed in swirling frost and mist. Its glowing eyes fixed on the group, and the temperature plummeted. The villagers froze, their breaths catching in their throats.
Mark stepped forward, raising his torch high. "We're not afraid of you," he shouted, though his voice trembled. The spirit tilted its head, the motion almost curious. Then it raised one clawed hand, and the wind howled, the snow rising in a blinding flurry.
The villagers scattered as the spirit lunged, its massive form crashing into the ground where they had stood. Mark rolled to the side, the heat of his torch cutting through the icy blast. "Keep it distracted," he shouted. The villagers regrouped, their torches and weapons flashing in the dim light. They moved as one, circling the spirit and attacking from all sides. The flames seemed to stagger it, the frost retreating slightly wherever the fire touched. But the spirit was fast, too fast. Its claws slashed through the air, knocking several villagers to the ground. Mark gritted his teeth and charged toward the shattered obelisk. If the spirit's power was still tied to the fragments, he might be able to use them against it. He reached the center of the clearing, grabbing one of the glowing shards. The icy surface burned his hands, but he didn't let go. He turned back to the spirit, the shard pulsing faintly in his grip. "Hey!" he shouted, drawing its attention. The spirit turned, its glowing eyes narrowing. It lunged toward him, its massive form casting a shadow over the clearing. At the last second, Mark thrust the shard into its chest. The spirit let out an ear-piercing scream, its body convulsing violently. The snow around it exploded outward, and the villagers were thrown back by the force of the blast. Mark held on, driving the shard deeper as the frost spirit's form began to crack, its icy surface splintering like glass. "End this," he muttered through gritted teeth. With one final push, the shard pierced through the spirit's core. The frost spirit shattered, its form dissolving into a cloud of mist and light. The air grew still, the oppressive cold lifting as the whispers faded into silence. Mark collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion. The clearing was quiet now, the forest surrounding it eerily calm. The villagers began to rise, their faces pale, but filled with cautious relief. The innkeeper approached Mark, helping him to his feet. "You did it," she said softly. Mark nodded, his breath fogging in the air. "It's over."
The group returned to the village, their torches flickering weakly in the early morning light. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, a deep, endless blue. For the first time in years, the village felt free.
Mark stood at the edge of the square, staring back toward the forest. He could still feel the weight of the spirit's presence, faint but lingering, like a shadow on the edge of his mind. The innkeeper placed a hand on his shoulder. "You broke the cycle," she said. "The village will remember what you've done." Mark nodded, but said nothing. The forest was quiet now, but he knew its secrets were far from gone.